May 14th, 2008. Marshall, Minnesota. The parents of 19-year-old Brandon Swanson receive a late-night phone call from their son, who claims that his car has become stuck in a ditch in the middle of nowhere. His parents leave to go pick him up, but have trouble finding him. At one point, Brandon's father hears him shout a swear word over the phone, before the call abruptly cuts off. When he attempts to phone him back, Brandon does not answer. Even though his abandoned car is eventually found on a rural road, Brandon himself is never found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we will be chronicling one of the most baffling missing persons cases of the past decade, the 2008 disappearance of Brandon Swanson. As you probably know, for the month of October, our podcast will be covering creepy Halloween-themed stories. While this particular case did not take place at Halloween, it still fits the theme because I featured it in a very popular Halloween article I published at crack.com 3 years ago titled The 6 Creepiest Unexplained Phone Calls. I still remember when I first stumbled upon this case. I thought the circumstances of how Brandon disappeared sounded so frightening that I was surprised this mystery wasn't more well known. I mean, this is a scenario you would totally expect to find in a horror movie. Can you imagine what it would be like to be speaking with your son on the phone, hear him yell out a swear word, and then never hear from him again? One can only imagine what prompted Brandon to give off that reaction, and if it is the direct cause of his disappearance. And stay tuned, because a special surprise guest is going to pop in a little later with their own thoughts. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and shorter minisodes like this one. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout-out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved vanishing of Brandon Swanson. Our story begins in Minnesota in 2008. Our central figure is 19-year-old Brandon Swanson, who lives in the town of Marshall with his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, and his younger sister. Brandon is a student at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, and has just completed a 1-year program on wind energy. Since May 13th just happens to be the last day of classes, Brandon decides to celebrate by attending a get-together at a friend's house in the town of Lind. He stays until around 10:30, 11 p.m., before leaving to travel to a classmate's home in Canby in order to say goodbye to him. Sometime after midnight, Brandon climbs into his green Chevy Lumina sedan and begins his 30-mile drive back home to Marshall on Highway 68. At 1:54 a.m., Brian and Annette Swanson would receive a phone call at home from Brandon. He was calling on his cell phone and said that he had accidentally gotten his car stuck in a ditch, though he assured them that he wasn't hurt. It would turn out that Brandon initially attempted to call some of his friends for assistance, but when he couldn't reach them, he phoned his parents. So Brian and Annette left the house to go pick him up, but the problem was that Brandon had left Highway 68 and gotten his car stuck on a rural road in the middle of nowhere. While Brandon believed he was somewhere between Marshall and Lind, and only about a 10-minute drive from his home, his parents could not find him in the vicinity, and he had trouble communicating his exact location. When the Swansons stopped at a spot where they believed Brandon might be near, they started flashing the lights on their pickup truck. Annette told Brandon to look for the flashing lights, and she could hear Brandon clicking his own lights over the phone, but neither of them was able to see each other in the distance. Brandon became very frustrated, and said that he was going to walk to Lind. Brian told Brandon that he would drop Annette off at home, and then come back and try to pick him up afterwards. So after taking his wife back to their house, Brian continued driving around some dark back roads in search of his son. He was on the phone with Brandon for 47 straight minutes, but just could not locate him. Finally, at around 3:10 a.m., Brandon mentioned that he noticed some lights in the distance, which he believed was the town of Lind. Brandon said he was going to head in that direction, and that his father could meet him in the parking lot of a local tavern. His plan was to leave the road and take a shortcut across a field, because he believed the route would be quicker. Brandon also made mention of fence lines and being able to hear water running in the background. But then all of a sudden, Brian heard his son yell the words, "Oh, shit," before the call abruptly cut off. After this, Brian made several attempts to call Brandon back, but never got an answer. And incredibly, this would turn out to be the last time anyone ever heard from Brandon Swanson. After failing to locate their son for the rest of the night, the Swansons finally contacted the Lyon County Sheriff's Office at 6:30 a.m. and reported him missing. There was a delayed response, as the police said it was not uncommon for a 19-year-old college student to stay out all night while celebrating, and one officer even uttered the remark, he had a right to be missing. But of course that logic really didn't make any sense, since Brandon was flat out phoning his parents for a ride. When they finally initiated a search, the police were able to use Brandon's cell phone records to pinpoint the area where his vehicle was located. At around 12:30 p.m., the Chevy Lumina sedan was finally discovered stuck in the ditch on a rural gravel road about a mile and a half north of Highway 68. There was no sign of any serious damage to the car, or any indication that Brandon might have suffered an injury. However, even though an extensive search would eventually be performed of the surrounding area, there was no sign of Brandon anywhere, and one of the biggest disadvantages was that no one knew the exact direction Brandon was heading in when he walked away from his vehicle. And in spite of the abrupt ending to Brandon's final call with his father, his cell phone could not be found either. In the days following his disappearance, multiple calls were made to Brandon's phone, and they ended up ringing before they went to voicemail, which, on the surface, seemed to indicate that the phone might still be functional. The discovery of the vehicle only brought up more unanswered questions, as it was found in close proximity to the towns of Taunton and Porter. Even though Brandon had said during his last call that he was heading towards Lind, that particular town was located about 25 miles southeast from where his car was. Since there's no way Brandon could have possibly walked that distance during the time period he called his parents, he had obviously been confused about his location. But given that the trip from Canby to his home in Marshall could be made on a straight drive on Highway 68, what was Brandon doing on that isolated gravel road to begin with? Well, Brandon had been drinking alcohol while celebrating with his friends, and had at least one shot of whiskey while visiting his classmate in Canby, so it was easy to speculate that he might have been using the back roads to avoid the risk of possibly being pulled over by the authorities for a DUI. However, Brandon's friends claimed that while he was drinking that night, they did not believe he was intoxicated, and his parents didn't think he sounded intoxicated during their phone conversations either. Anyway, a search dog was brought in which picked up a trail and followed Brandon's scent from where his car was found. It traveled south down the road about a half a mile before arriving at another road and turning west. The dog traveled a mile and would have reached Highway 68 if it had gone another quarter mile or so, but instead, it turned right on County Road 16 and traveled north. After a half mile, the dog turned west on the driveway of an abandoned farm and eventually reached the bank of the Yellow Medicine River. It was here that the dog then jumped into the water before climbing back out again. It then continued northeast a little while longer before reaching a group of trees, and it's here where the dog lost the trail, about several hundred yards south from another gravel road called 160th Avenue. So this is a situation where I can literally say the trail went cold. The fact that the dog followed the trail straight into the Yellow Medicine River led to speculation that Brandon might have stumbled into the water in the dark and drowned, but an extensive search of the river turned up no trace of his body. The Swansons were never happy with the police's initial delay at launching a search effort for Brandon, so the following year, they responded by successfully lobbying to get a new law passed for missing persons cases in the state. It was called Brandon's Law, and requires Minnesota police to immediately take a report and initiate an investigation for missing adults of any age. There were jurisdictional issues in the early stages of Brandon's case, because his vehicle was found a mile and a half north of the Lyon-Lincoln County line, an area where 3 different counties came together. However, Brandon's Law has made it clear that in situations like this, jurisdiction will be given to the county where the missing person resides. It's pretty sad to hear the Swansons mention how they turned on the porch light for their son when they left their house that night to look for him, and for the next several years, they've stated during interviews that they are still leaving the porch light on in case he ever comes home. During one interview, Annette Swanson shared a very sad exchange she had with Brandon's sister, where she said, "I'm not sure Brandon is going to be found in my lifetime," only for her daughter to respond, "Mom, I don't think he's going to be found in my lifetime." In the past decade, it's estimated that tens of thousands of hours have been spent on search efforts for Brandon throughout a 120 square mile area. A lot of focus has been put on the section of farm fields located near Porter where the search dog's trail of Brandon's scent came to an end. Some people believe he ultimately met his fate in this area, but no trace of him has ever been found. Unfortunately, even though nearly a decade has passed, there are still no answers about what actually happened to Brandon Swanson. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Okay, so this is a prime example of a mystery which has been heavily discussed, literally because of an oh shit moment. In fact, it's pretty crazy that there are not one, but 2 heavily discussed unsolved missing persons cases involving young men named Brandon, who disappeared after being stranded in the middle of nowhere, and were last heard from on a strange cell phone call. The other Brandon, whom you've probably heard of, is Brandon Lawson, who vanished in rural Texas in 2013. but the key difference between these cases is that an actual recording exists of Brandon Lawson's final phone call, which has been heavily dissected, but one does not exist for Brandon Swanson. Hearing his tone of voice when he said his final words could shed a little bit of light on the situation. Like I said before, the whole scenario seems like something out of a horror film, and you could easily infer that Brandon was yelling, "Oh shit," because he saw a crazed killer approaching him or something. But right from the outset, I've always wondered if some of the spookiness of this case has been blown out of proportion because of those two words. The actual explanation could be something very mundane, such as Brandon tripping and dropping his phone in the dark, and the only reason those turned out to be his last words is because he couldn't find his phone after that. We don't know if Brandon sounded frightened or frustrated when he said those two words, and only his father could answer that question for sure. There's also been some debate over the fact that all calls to Brandon's phone over the course of the next few days rang instead of going straight to voicemail, which could be seen as a sign that the phone was still functional. Well, here's an excerpt from a missing persons case study written by Jeff Hasse, the search manager from Midwest Technical Rescue Training, who has organized the searches for Brandon. And I quote, "According to one of our team members who is an executive at a regional telephone company, the ring that you hear when you call someone has little to do with what is happening at the other end. It's an artificial sound that is generated at a switch in some building, not by the recipient's phone. It is a holdover from the old analog phone days. The way a phone handles voicemail when it is turned off or disabled is entirely dependent on how this function is programmed at the phone carrier's computer systems. Therefore, there is a great deal of variability regarding how it works between carriers, calling plans, and even models of phones." End quote. So in other words, if Brandon seriously damaged his phone by dropping it in the river or something, it's not impossible that anyone who tried calling him would still hear ringing on their end, even if the phone was no longer functional. Anyway, the temperature at the time Brandon went missing was around 46 degrees Fahrenheit and dropped to a low of 39 that night, so this could just be a simple case of him dying of exposure. I know that a lot of extensive searches have been performed of the area, but as I've said time and time again on this podcast, even the most thorough searches can miss human remains. If you want to get an idea of just how difficult search efforts like these can be, I'd recommend visiting a blog called The Search for Brandon Swanson. It hasn't been updated since 2011, but it provides a very thorough and detailed account of the searches which were performed for Brandon, and you can see how challenging they really are. Everyone involved in these search efforts does remarkable work and should be commended for doing this, but finding human remains in such a vast 120 square mile area is one hell of a daunting task. Of course, one of the biggest unanswered questions in this case is what Brandon was doing on that gravel road to begin with, as he could have easily made the drive from Canby to his home in Marshall without leaving Highway 68. Well, the obvious answer is that he was intoxicated and was using the back roads to lessen the risk of being pulled over by law enforcement. I know that Brandon's friends claimed that he did not consume enough alcohol that night to impair his driving, and while you should ordinarily take those claims with a grain of salt, it's worth noting that the police themselves have stated that they don't believe Brandon was intoxicated. But even if Brandon was under the legal limit and capable of driving, he may have still been paranoid enough to avoid the cops and decided to drive on the back roads, even though he really didn't have to. Now, one rumor you'll often come across online is that a pipe was found in Brandon's car. The main source I could find for this was an excerpt from a 2008 article in the Marshall Independent, which was cut and pasted onto a message board, but unfortunately, the actual link to the original article is dead. There's mention in this excerpt of the pipe possibly being tested for drugs, but I've been unable to find any follow-up on this. If Brandon was using this pipe to smoke marijuana that night, this might explain a lot about his actions, but given that I haven't seen any other mention of the pipe since then, I'll assume it has no relevance to this case. The fact of the matter is that Brandon was driving on dark gravel roads in the middle of the night, so he wouldn't even have to be impaired or intoxicated in order to get lost and stuck in a ditch. It might seem baffling that Brandon saw lights in the distance and assumed he was near the town of Lind when his vehicle was found 25 miles northwest from Lind. The lights he saw were probably from either the town of Porter or Taunton, so it's easy to assume that Brandon might have gotten disoriented. However, remember that he was in a rural area surrounded by nothing but farmland. At night, all of those gravel roads are going to look the same, and Brandon wouldn't have had GPS to help him out. If he made a wrong turn somewhere, it's easy to imagine him becoming very mixed up about where he was. Another key piece of information about Brandon is that he was legally blind in his left eye, and if this affected his depth perception, it's certainly possible that he could have gotten lost and slipped and fallen into the Yellow Medicine River in the dark. If this occurred while he was speaking with his father on the phone, that might have been the source of his oh shit moment. Some people have speculated that Brandon could have fallen into an abandoned well or cistern while talking on the phone, which would explain why his body has never been found. But search teams have failed to uncover any wells or cisterns in the area which they believe he could have stepped into. The Yellow Medicine River has been thoroughly searched, and it seems reasonably certain that Brandon is not in there, but since one of the search dogs trailing Brandon's scent jumped into the river and jumped back out again, it's reasonable to assume that Brandon could have fallen into the water and climbed out before eventually succumbing to hypothermia. Now, even though the dog soon lost Brandon's scent, that doesn't necessarily mean Brandon didn't keep on traveling past that point. The trail ended several hundred yards away from the road, 160th Avenue, so if Brandon made it that far, he could have conceivably been picked up by a passing motorist. So let's examine the possibility that Brandon met with foul play. When you consider Brandon's final words, it's very tempting to believe this theory, but really, given how remote this area was, what are the odds of Brandon crossing paths with someone out there who did him harm? Pretty low, I'd say. If Brandon was followed out there by someone who wanted to harm him, why would they let him walk around for over an hour speaking to his parents on the phone before they made their move? The most likely scenario of Brandon becoming a victim of foul play is if he managed to flag down a ride from someone who murdered him and disposed of his body, but again, what are the odds of running into someone like that on a remote gravel road in the middle of the night? Another possibility is that Brandon could have made it to the road and been struck by a vehicle, and whoever was responsible took his body out of the area. But given that this was a dark rural area where no witnesses were around, would a hit-and-run motorist really go to the trouble of moving Brandon's body? Since there's very little chance that they'd ever be caught, I have my doubts. I don't completely discount the possibility that Brandon met with foul play, but if I had to go with the most likely theory, I'd say that Brandon probably died of exposure out there, and his remains simply haven't been found. But I've seen another very intriguing theory discussed online, which might explain why his remains haven't been found. What if Brandon died of exposure, or simply passed out while walking through one of the farmer's fields, and was subsequently run over the next time someone went through that field with a piece of equipment? If you look at the Search for Brandon Swanson blog, it says that 2 of the dogs picked up a scent of human remains on a field cultivator during one of their searches. That doesn't necessarily mean the cultivator had any contact with Brandon, as there are many different reasons a dog could have detected a scent there, but it is an intriguing possibility. If such a thing did occur, you might be wondering why the person responsible would go to the trouble of covering things up, given that Brandon's death was accidental, and for all we know, he might have already been dead before he was run over. But I could see someone panicking over such a situation and getting rid of the evidence, instead of informing the authorities about what they did. However, before we bring things to a conclusion, there's one more unique theory I'd like to share, which an associate of mine came up with, and, well, I'll let him take it from here.
Hey all, Joe here from Thinking Sideways to talk about Brandon. First off, one of the nagging little questions about this story is, how could Brandon have been in a place that was 20 miles from where he said he was? A lot of people are still scratching their heads over that one, and I've been doing the same thing. I've pondered it a bit, and I've begun to suspect, based on some new information especially, that maybe Brandon wasn't actually lost after all. But of course, if that's the case, that makes it even stranger, because then why would he lie to his parents? Why do you call your parents, ask them for a ride, and then give them misinformation about your actual location? Well, one thing that's occurred to me is that maybe Brandon wasn't alone in the car. What if he picked up a hitchhiker? Or maybe he was on his way out of Canby and stopped at a convenience store, and some nice young man with a knife or a gun asked him for a ride. So let's think about this scenario for a minute. Let's imagine that down the road a little bit with his new friend, Brandon, thinking quickly, decided that maybe it would be better to crash his car into a ditch rather than take his new serial killer buddy home to meet the family. Again, it's kind of a stretch, but let's keep going with it. Now, here's some of the new information I've gotten about Brandon, stuff he said to his parents on the phone. Number one, he told his parents that he was between his hometown of Marshall, Minnesota, and the town of Lind, which is about 5-6 miles southwest of Marshall. He said that he was just off Highway 23, which is the connector between Marshall and Lind. And again, this is 20 miles from where he actually was. Then Brandon later clarified a little bit, got a little more specific. He said he was on the road between the Savannah Oaks Golf Course and the town of Lind, and again, just off Highway 23. Now, the only road that fits that description between Lind and the golf course is County Road 72, also known as 235th Avenue, which runs along the southern edge of the golf course. Which is really interesting, because how could Brandon, standing next to an empty, flat cornfield in May, which is planting season, ground was bare, have believed that it was a golf course? Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, it was dark, but actually it wasn't. The moon was up. It was 83% full on the night of May 14th, 2008. So I think there was enough light to tell the difference between a cornfield and a golf course. Also, County Road 72 just looks a lot different from the road that Brandon was actually on, which runs straight as an arrow for miles. County Road 72 is a lot twistier. It's only a mile long. It's got no crop fields on either side of it. It's either trees in some places, houses in others, but there's no farmland, there's no fields. And Brandon, by the way, had friends in the town of Lind, so he had to have known this. It's a very tiny town. Look at it on the aerial if you don't believe me. And it's only got a few streets. Now, we also know that after Brandon's folks drove around and were unable to find him, he decided to leave his car and walk to the Linwood Tavern. Now, what's strange about this is that if he was just off Highway 23 on County Road 72, like he said he was, then the big question is why didn't he walk to 23 to meet his parents? If they were coming from Marshall to Lind, then they would have come down Highway 23, so that would seem like the obvious place to meet them. And that actually would have been a much shorter walk for Brandon than going to the tavern. So, strange, huh? But according to a study of the case that was written by Jeff Haas, whose name I am probably mispronouncing, so sorry, Jeff, but Jeff ran the search effort for Brandon. Here I'm going to quote here, quote, the phone conversation suggests that he was single-minded in his determination to go to the tavern, unquote. In other words, it sounds like his folks maybe said that he had to just walk to Highway 23 and meet them. Sounds like he insisted on going to the tavern instead, which is a little odd. And another odd thing about Brandon is after he left his car to walk to the tavern, he walked about 2 miles over gravel roads, and we know this because the search team with the dog tracked him the following day. And then he told his father on the phone that he was cutting across a creepy abandoned farm to save time. This is the same abandoned farm where Brandon had his OS moment, and then we never heard from him again. This farm was to the west of the road he was on, so obviously his intention was to cut diagonally across the fields to 160th Avenue, which runs east-west on the north side of that farm. And he was going to continue walking west. That was his general trend, is walking west. But Brandon didn't cut diagonally across the farm. Instead, what he did is he walked due west down the driveway, past the abandoned farmhouse and barn, which is about a quarter mile from the road, and continued west into the trees and up to the edge of the north branch of the Yellow Medicine River. And then his path led away from there, and then followed the tree line to the northwest before it was eventually lost by the dog a couple hundred yards short of 160th Avenue. Again, I have to ask why. If Brandon intended to save time by cutting across the farm, then why didn't he just cut across and go diagonally across the farm? The route that he took was actually slower than if he had stayed on the road. So, quick recap here. Brandon says he's in a place that's 20 miles from where he actually is. Says he's on a road next to a golf course, a road that runs through the woods, when he is actually in the middle of a bunch of really flat fields with the nearest tree half a kilometer away. And I know this because I measured it on the aerial. Says he's just off Highway 23, but refuses to walk to 23 so his parents can pick him up. Says he's cutting across an abandoned farm to save time, but then takes a circuitous route. That saves him no time at all. All a little strange. And let's go back a second. So let's imagine, as I said earlier, that Brandon deliberately drove his car into a ditch. And then he turns to his new serial killer friend, and we'll call him Aaron, just to give him a name. Turns to Aaron and says, geez, I'm sorry, but the highway is right down there, so, I'm sure you can hitch a ride. At which point Aaron, of course, fingering his big knife, landor gun, says, no, you are going to get on the phone and find us another ride, dude. So Brandon, decides to do what he says, calls a few friends, gets no answer. Remember, this is like 1:15 in the morning. Eventually, after 40 minutes, he calls his parents. Took him 40 minutes to do that, and which is, again, kind of interesting, because if Brandon was by himself, where he said he was, then he was about 7 miles from his house. In the 40 minutes it took him to call his parents, he could have walked halfway home. He didn't do that. Interesting. And I'm assuming that Aaron was not as familiar with the area as Brandon, and maybe he was just a passing through serial killer kind of guy. So when Brandon fed his parents BS about where he was, Aaron was none the wiser. But eventually, of course, as you know, Brandon's parents drove all over the place, flashing their lights looking, and they weren't able to find him. Maybe Aaron got a little restless. Maybe Brandon decided that it was time to change the subject, so maybe he suggested they walk to the Linwood Tavern, and maybe he said, hey, Aaron, when we get there, you could stab one of the patrons and just take his car, huh? So Brandon calls his parents on the phone and tells them he's walking to the tavern. And then presumably this is the point at which one of the parents said the obvious, which would be, dude, why don't you just walk to Highway 23 and we'll get you? But remember, Brandon was single-minded in his determination, according to Jeff Hasse, to go to the tavern. Why would Brandon insist on this when it would have been easier just to walk to the highway? Again, this is all pure conjecture on my part. We'll probably never know exactly what happened that night. But when you look at it through this framework, Brandon's words and actions that night do make a bit more sense. Of course, there's a big flaw to the theory, I know, which is that Brandon had a long phone call with his dad, which you wouldn't think Aaron would have allowed. But then on the other hand, maybe Aaron was, figured, hey, I'm here right next to Brandon. I got a big, huge knife, and Brandon won't dare say a word that'll make me angry. So maybe that was it. I don't know. But I like this theory a little bit better than the hypothermia theory, because my problem with the hypothermia is it doesn't explain some of the strange stuff that I talked about earlier. It doesn't explain the lack of a body. I'm thinking he had a serial killer in the car with him. Anyway, that's it for me. This is Joe. Thanks a lot, Robin. See you soon.
Thank you very much, Joe. I gotta say, that hitchhiker theory is one I never thought of before, and I don't think I've ever seen something like this mentioned on any message boards discussing the case. I had never heard that tidbit about the golf course, and if there were no crops to hide Brandon's body in any of those fields, then that pokes a hole in the theory about him accidentally being run over by a cultivator. Admittedly, like Joe said, the odds of Brandon picking up a hitchhiker who turned out to be a dangerous killer, and this guy letting him talk on the phone with his parents for over an hour, are pretty remote. But he's right, there are some odd things about Brandon's actions and behavior which just cannot be explained. This is why, even though I still lean towards the dying of exposure theory, I can't get completely behind it 100%. Whatever happened, I have a feeling that Brandon did perish out there that night, and given the amount of effort which has been spent searching for him, I can only hope that all this hard work will pay off eventually, and his remains will be found. Or at the very least, I hope evidence will be uncovered which provides some answers about what happened, so that the Swansons can finally turn off their porch light after all these years. So if you have any information about what happened to Brandon Swanson, please call Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension tip line at 1-877-996-6222. That's 1-877-996-6222. Anyway, I need to send out a big thanks to my friend Joe from the Thinking Sideways podcast for stopping by. If you're wondering how this came about, the Thinking Sideways crew did their own episode about Brandon Swanson last year and read the text from my Cracked article about creepy unexplained phone calls, which, needless to say, was a major geek-out moment for me. At the time, they had no idea who I was, or that I hosted my own true crime podcast, but when I got in touch with them, Joe shared a new theory he had dreamed up after they finished recording and said that I could use it if I ever did my own episode about the case. Well, cut to 1 year later, after I've already hung out with the Thinking Sideways crew at CrimeCon and been a guest on their anniversary show, I decided to take Joe up on his offer and asked if he would be willing to record a brief soundbite for this minisode, and he came through in a big way. So a big thanks to Joe, Steve, and Devin for their work on Thinking Sideways and for being so supportive and generous of their fellow podcasters. Anyway, if you have your own theory about what happened to Brandon, please feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. And before we bring things to a close, I'd like to play a promo for one of the very best podcasts you'll find from my home country, Canadian True Crime, hosted by Christy Lee. Within only a couple months of its launch earlier this year, this podcast skyrocketed to the top of the iTunes charts here in Canada, and deservedly so. Have a listen.
Hi, this is Christy Lee, host of the Canadian True Crime Podcast. My podcast tells Canadian stories of cruel people who committed heinous acts and honours innocent victims who are no longer with us. I start with a deep dive into the story of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, with information you probably haven't heard, and then I venture into some lesser-known Canadian crime stories. You can find me on your favourite podcast app. Just search for Canadian True Crime.
So big thanks to all my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, and of course the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. We also have a new donor this week named John, so thank you very much, John. I need to provide a big shout out to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who provides the eerie music you hear on every episode, and as you probably noticed, has composed a creepier version of the Trail Went Cold theme for this month's shows. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a private Facebook discussion group for The Trail Went Cold, so if you want to discuss the podcast or its featured cases with myself or your fellow listeners, feel free to join the group at any time, and I'll approve your entry ASAP. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for our final Halloween-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold.